This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. 50 years after the Watts riots, we talk today about race as a cultural, not a genetic artifact, and about the history of community organizing to achieve power. Anthropologist Richard Perry tells us there is an upsurge in discredited theories that genes determine how we act. And Professor Schutz reminds us how both President Obama and Hillary Clinton were disciples of the father of community organizing, Saul Alinsky. And Bill Press talks with Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz about the Iran nuclear deal. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Anthropologist Richard Perry won't even use the word race without quotation marks because it's not a biologically valid category. We are who we are, he says, because of what we've learned. And we say hello to Richard Perry, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at St. Lawrence University. He is the author of a new book called Killer Apes, Naked Apes, and Just Plain Nasty People. Richard Perry, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Well, it's a pleasure.
Now, of course, we usually talk about politics on this program, and we will, but your background is anthropology and science. So to begin with, can you tell us why you wrote this book and a little bit of what the title means?
Well, yes, it's I've spent most of my life in anthropology, and, a jolly ride it's been. But, with regard to the matter at hand, with reference to the influence of genes on human behavior, I think in retrospect, most anthropologists nowadays have considered the idea of genetic determinism or race-based behavior to be a closed question that was settled a long time ago and thoroughly discredited. It's true that every so often we read about some alleged gene for dating preferences or a warrior gene or something of that sort, and usually in places like the New York Times where people really should know better. But it's hard to tell how many people actually take this sort of thing seriously. But then after I retired, I had a bit of a rude awakening when my son, who was a college student, told me about a course reading assignment that clearly was arguing for strong genetic influence on human behavior. I found it kind of hard to believe that any serious academics were still pushing this stuff. Especially since time and again, serious researchers have refuted these kinds of claims. But it turned out I really hadn't been paying enough attention. And once I started to, it began to seem as if a lot of the things that anthropologists of my vintage, at least, had come to take for granted, the idea that culture is learned or that racism has no basis in reality, had pretty much faded from memory in some circles. Once I began looking, I was kind of dismayed to see how much of the bad old stuff was still around. The newer versions tended to avoid overt racism, although not all of them did. I mean, in 2014, a book appeared by Nicholas Wade called A Troublesome Inheritance, arguing that various races differ in their capacity for civilization. That was published by Penguin, which is not exactly a fly-by-night outfit. I should add, though, the reviewers did pounce on it, and it seemed to disappear fairly quickly. But most of the stuff I ran into wasn't quite as raw, but a lot of it showed a fascination with the idea that genes pretty much determine our lives. In one op-ed piece in the Sunday New York Times, again, the author argued that people differ genetically in their tendency to accumulate wealth. And the evidence he presented for this was that historically, wealth often passes down in family lines. Imagine that. So despite my naive optimism, it turned out that these old ideas hadn't really gone away after all. And in fact, they seem to be having a kind of upsurge. And it's sort of disappointing for those of us who'd like to believe in progress.
Well, it's amazing. You make the reference to the title back in 2014, and that sounds like something you would have heard maybe in 1950, not 2014. There are a lot of political issues right now that involve science. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, in my opinion, I think valid science is almost always a good thing. Of course, the results of science can be used to do bad things, like dropping bombs on people and so on. But the thing about science, unlike social philosophy, is that it changes inevitably. Social philosophy, not necessarily. One of the themes of this book is that the philosophical perspectives underlying these arguments have been around for a long, long time. And science is always subject to challenge. I mean, if the term survival of the fittest applies anywhere, it applies in science. There's a fundamental aspect of creating a hypothesis is that the next step is to try to refute it through testing it against data, against evidence to see whether it holds up. And some of the ideas I critique in this book about these arguments for the biological basis of human behavior haven't really changed much in more than a century, despite the fact that science has never supported them. At one time there was a tendency toward promiscuity or poverty or character flaws of various kinds were considered inherent, in the blood. Now we hear about genes for this or that. The vocabulary's changed, but not the fundamental idea.
What is the proper response, would you think, to a climate change denier who says, "I'm not a scientist"?
Well,
because you hear it all the time.
Yeah. Well, most people in the world could truthfully say that. That's why it's a good thing that we have people who are scientists, so we don't have to.
Right.
But what that kind of statement usually means, of course, is that I choose to ignore all the valid evidence that scientists have provided us. And it's hard to say why they say that, but no doubt to please certain members of the audience.
Sure. We're speaking with Richard Perry, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at St. Louis University and author of a new book called Killer Apes, Naked Apes, and Just Plain Nasty People. And actually, some of the worst political offenders in trashing science are scientists, thinking in particular of several physicians, including Rand Paul. So what's being taught in medical school that would have these otherwise kind of outlandish thoughts coming out of people that are educated in science?
Yeah. Well, at this point, I guess I should say I'm not a mind reader. But and we can only speculate why people who should know better claim not to. In some cases, certainly, it's a tactic designed to gain favor with some constituency or other. But you're right. I mean, we have some pretty bizarre cases, like Congressman Paul Brown of Georgia, who is a physician, no less, who's ranted that the idea of evolution comes, quote, straight from the pits of hell. For some reason, he also includes the science of embryology in his condemnations. So, there are lots of unanswered questions here. I have to say I really don't know what's taught in medical schools, but probably not that.
Yeah, I guess that's probably safe for us to assume. Your book, Killer Apes, Naked Apes, and Just Plain Nasty People, is a condemnation of a school of thought called biological determinism, and you actually touched on it briefly before. Can you explain a little bit more about what it means and why it's practiced throughout history pretty much only by conservatives?
Well, the general sense of biological determinism is that our genes, or in some cases historically our race, pretty much direct how we behave, including, of course, placing limits on our abilities. Of course, nobody I know of would argue that we don't have genetic limits on what we can do. But one of the major conclusions of real biological science over the past century or so is that biologically, humans really don't differ that much from one another, even though they do all kinds of different things. Because, we know only identical twins have totally matching genes, of course, but as far as genetic differences among populations are concerned, as the geneticist Richard Lewontin pointed out quite a few years ago, any two people within the same population are likely to differ from one another more than the average collective gene frequencies of any two populations. But still, the arguments for strong biological influences on behavior imply that significant change is pretty much ruled out. Now, it would take evolution for that to happen, and that takes a long time. So if conservatism means that significant change is undesirable, then biological determinism can be an appealing point of view. But I would not argue that only conservatives have been biological determinists. For example, the noted linguist Noam Chomsky, who's taken up a number of liberal and progressive causes over the years, also argues that structures of language are biologically inherent. And he goes a bit farther than that to say that most ideas are that sort of pre-exist in the brain. And, if we look back a few generations, a lot of the major proponents of eugenics in the early 20th century who argued for the forced sterilization of people that they defined as unfit were considered liberals in their time. Margaret Sanger, the hero of the women's rights movement, was very enthusiastic about eugenics. Of course, that was before the Holocaust. We know people are complicated, and sometimes we have no problems in holding contradictory ideas at the same time. But still, given the implications of biological determinism for the possibility of progressive change, I think most of the marbles pretty much roll to one side or the other.
And I want to touch on something else, race. And you had started to talk a little bit about this as we got started. But race has always been, and is right now, arguably the most divisive issue in American history. Yet you put the word itself in quotation marks. Why is that?
Well, I put the word race in quotes to acknowledge that most people who've studied the issue no longer consider it a biologically valid or justified category. In doing that, I follow people like the paleoanthropologist C. Loring Brace, whose book, Race is a four-letter word, with race in quotes, of course, is a very important work on the subject. And I think there's a tendency among more and more people to use the word that way.
Richard Perry, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at St. Lawrence University. You ought to check out the new book called Killer Apes, Naked Apes, and Just Plain Nasty People. Richard, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Okay, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. Community organizing expert Aaron Schutz says that only through conflict can you get the powerful to treat you as equals. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you think that none of today's presidential candidates care about people like you, check out Republican Scott Walker. The Wisconsin governor not only cares, he wants to sit down with you, get your ideas, and stay in close touch. No matter who you are, Scotty wants you to join his team so his presidency can be your presidency. Not a Republican? No problemo, amigo. Walker doesn't check your papers. Well, except for that $1 million check you have to write to his super PAC. That's the ticket price for entering Walker's inner circle, where you can discuss your policy concerns and seek personal favors straight from your lips to the candidate's ear. Even if you're a common working stiff, just give $1 million and you're in. Is this a great country or what? Maybe you're wondering what specifically your money buys. Well, Scott's Super PAC even prints out a handy purchasing slip showing that you'll be, quote, an executive board member of the Walkerites campaign. Thus, you'll have 2 private dinners with a man, a Walker staffer dedicated to your needs, special briefings and weekly emails, bi-monthly conference calls, biannual retreats, and best of all, quote, an exclusive executive board pen. Golly, I haven't been this excited or felt so included since the 1950s when I became a member of the Mickey Mouse Club and got my own set of mouse ears. This is Jim Hightower saying, when the Supreme Court descended into the Alice in Wonderland fantasy that corporations are people and money is speech, it was inevitable that American politics would devolve to a frivolous game that shuts out the workaday majority and enthrones a Koch brothers plutocracy sustained by secret money super PACs and whorish candidates like Walker. To help end this corrupt mockery of our electoral democracy, go to democracyisforpeople.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor. All for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Aaron Schutz explains the history of community organizing from its founding father, Saul Alinsky, through Barack Obama, whom he suggests wanted people to be engaged, but then got annoyed when they did. And we say hello to Aaron Schutz, professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Community Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's also the co-editor with Mike Miller of a new book, People Power, The Community Organizing Tradition of Saul Alinsky. Aaron Schutz, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Sure, happy to be here.
And we appreciate your time with us, too. Your book is a collection of essays about the most notable community organizer of recent times, the late Saul Alinsky. The second most notable one is President Obama, yet you seem to be critical of him for choosing electoral politics as a means of social change. Isn't he more effective in the White House?
Well, I think we need to be clear that the problem is not electoral politics. I mean, we need electoral politics. The problem is that almost all we have is electoral politics. So we have massive funding for elections during the election cycle, and then everybody goes away, and there's very little for long-term organizing. We're funding these brief mobilizations to vote, and we're not really making an effort to build power and leadership in local communities. But if we did that, it would have an impact on voting. And if you're interested, I could talk a little bit about how Obama organized his first campaign based a little bit on his community organizing experience.
Absolutely. Go for it.
So Obama's first campaign was organized really by this person, Marshall Gantz, who had originally worked with Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross in California on the United Farm Workers efforts. And he is an excellent organizer, a really brilliant man, and he taught Obama organizers some organizing techniques. But what he really did, because his job was not to teach people to organize power in local communities, he really taught them to do short-term mobilization of voters. So he took some of the organizing techniques and kind of transformed them to serve that purpose. And he actually ended up doing what I call it an evangelical approach. So, this is what evangelicals do to convert people. So he told them how to create a conversion story. How were they converted to Obama? And they were supposed to tell it with real feeling to encourage others to convert. And they were supposed to avoid talk about issues. And so then here comes the election. And after the election, they don't really know how to move from this kind of evangelical model to long-term organizer because, for good reason, Gantz didn't really teach them how to do it. And let's face it, elected officials don't want independent organizing. And hopefully we'll talk about this a little as we go ahead. So officials get elected, like Obama, and they think they know the answers. And frankly, it makes them upset to be pressured by the people. So, Obama is effective around the issues he cares about. And he's pressured by those organizations that currently have power. So there are a few grassroots organizations that actually can put pressure on him. So he actually receives pressure mostly from corporate lobbyists, unions, advocacy groups that don't really represent many actual individuals. And what happened with Obama's organizing campaign is he basically defanged it. He put it under the Democratic Committee. He blocked independent organizing. So people in, I guess it's Organizing for America now, I don't remember exactly the name, they couldn't even organize during the debate over health care to push Democratic folks farther to the left because, of course, the Democratic Committee couldn't organize against Democrats. So, to try to finish up, Obama used the FDR quote, "You've convinced me, now make me do it." But he defanged his own organization that, to the extent they could have organized, given they weren't really taught how, could have tried to make him do things. So, on the one hand, politicians say they want the people to be engaged. On the other hand, it's really annoying if they are.
And, interestingly, another Alinsky follower, Hillary Clinton. Tell us about their relationship.
Wade Rathke, the former chief organizer of ACORN, he just wrote a series about Hillary and Alinsky, interestingly enough. And, this fits pretty much with all about it. And the upshot is that as an undergraduate, Clinton wrote a pretty standard thesis on Alinsky-based organizing. And this was not a kind of "we're not worthy" adulation, but it was quite critical in many ways. Mostly, as Rathke says, she was, at that point, a child of the New Left who thought Alinsky didn't go far enough. But she didn't really know Alinsky well. Alinsky did offer her a job, actually, but she didn't take it. And unlike Obama, she was never actually an organizer. So basically, Hillary Clinton wrote a paper on Alinsky. What impact this had on her in any important way, especially after so many years, is really, who knows? I guess the only thing you could say is at least she understands what community organizing is from an Alinsky perspective, which, is more than 99% of the rest of the country.
Now, President Obama was denounced by Sarah Palin and others for being a mere, quote-unquote, community organizer. But aren't all politicians just that? I mean, people who determine a community's need and organize different elements together under a common banner?
Well, as I noted, politicians don't organize communities. They periodically mobilize people to get to the polls. They have no incentive to organize independent leadership and power in communities that then, they turn around and pressure them to do things that they don't really want to do. The leaders of organizing groups are not supposed to determine a community's needs. So, when you're saying, well, the politicians determine what the community needs, that's really not what an organizer is supposed to do. They're supposed to work with the community to figure out what the community really cares about and facilitate efforts to pursue changes around these issues. So, the other thing is that Palin's comment got a lot of press, but frankly, the evidence is that very few people in America understand what Alinsky-based organizing is. There was actually a poll that showed people didn't understand it. So the media seems to see organizing as basically another form of electoral politics. I was interviewed a couple of times by Ari Shapiro from NPR. He's a very smart guy. And he just didn't seem to understand what organizing was. And if he doesn't get it, it's hard to see how anybody else gets it.
Yeah. What a smart guy isn't picking it up. So what does a good community organizer do? And where is the need for that in today's society?
Well, as our book People Power shows, a good community organizer is focused on building durable democratic power in communities. To do this, an organizer draws on existing relationships in institutions and outside of institutions, and, she helps build new relationships and develops new leaders. The key learning tool in organizing is action. So leaders really learn about, not through trainings, but through actual experiences engaging in conflict with powerful people. Then they make sense of their experiences in evaluations after action. So, Alinsky was really opposed to this kind of have people sit around in classrooms and talk about organizing, which actually I do. I can talk about that if you want to, which I think accomplishes some things, but it certainly doesn't teach people to organize. Now, this is really important. This is something that especially people on the right do not understand. The aim of organizing, whether we like it or not, is reformist, not revolutionary. Alinsky really wanted America to live up to the ideals that at least he saw in the founding fathers, among others. So community organizers groups generally don't want to destroy people. They want to get to the table where decisions are made, and they want to be able to negotiate with powerful individuals as relative equals. Only through conflict, the organizers believe, demonstrating power will get people the respect they need to engage as relative equals with the powerful. So when the powerful are unwilling to negotiate in good faith, well, then they go back to a more confrontational stance. Now, this, again, I think is important to understand. My students and other people say, well, people are apathetic today. And organizers don't believe in apathy. And the truth is, anyone who's completely apathetic about their life is either seriously depressed or dead. And sometimes I ask my students, do you know anybody who is apathetic? And when they really think about it, they don't. But organizers believe people, especially in oppressed communities, feel hopeless. So it's a very different thing than apathy. And the only way to start overcoming this hopelessness is to show people through their actual experience that if they work together, they can have the power to make change. You can't tell them, oh, if you do this, you make change. They have to experience it, and then they're able to move forward.
It's a hands-on type of learning process.
Right, but also an emotional learning process, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a great story in our book about, and how much you want to include this, I don't know, but Richard Harmon, who was one of the key organizers of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is still around, he talks about how you get a bunch of middle-class people and you have them go meet with an alderman, and then what you do is, because the middle-class people don't want to get into a conflict, you have them you're asking for something, and then you ask for a timeline. And whenever the alderman tries to avoid or say, well, I don't know, and then you just keep pushing the person for a timeline. And Harmon says something like, and when they get hit with the bucket of ish from the alderman, they realize that there are people who have power that don't respect them. So you either get a win, and that teaches people something, or people get stepped on, and suddenly that changes their perspective of their politicians and power, and they're more ready to organize. They're like, okay, now I'm angry.
Yeah. We're speaking with Aaron Schutz, professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Community Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, co-editor with Mike Miller of a new book, People Power, The Community Organizing Tradition of Saul Alinsky. And by the way, if you want to check that book out, you can go to organizetrainingcenter.org. Aaron, community organizing, which is closely related to union organizing and to the social gospel of many churches, seems to be exclusively the province of progressives. But wasn't the rise of the Tea Party similar in that it began with small groups of people with slightly different agendas who formed coalitions?
Well, when I teach organizing, I generally, I use examples across the spectrum because, I don't feel like it's my job to tell people what to do. I try to teach people how to do things, and then, they have to decide what they want to do. At the same time, there is a core ethical guide to organizing, and that's democracy, which surprises a lot of people. So in the ideal, organizing should be bottom-up, reflecting the desires and concerns of the community. Alinsky believed that if you got people together, especially across racial, ethnic, ideological divides, etc., that people would do ultimately the right thing. This is something that may surprise people about Alinsky. And if you read his books, you see how intense his belief is in that. The only option for an organizer who finds an organization is doing things that he or she finds unethical is actually to leave, right? Because organizers are not leaders. Of course, this doesn't mean that organizers don't have a lot of influence. But because you're trying to draw from a diverse community, the truth is that organizing is usually pretty moderate. I would say not progressive, but center-left. With a significant number, often, of relatively conservative participants. And because of differences across these participants, organizing groups, they usually come together around a set of, pretty general core values around human worth, concern for children, drug treatment, stuff like that. So this generally leads organizing to be relatively moderate. But it does mean that if organizers are really marching in lockstep following top-down directives, they're not an example of organizing. the most famous aspects of organizing, the tactics for confronting the powerful. So one of the most famous, which Alinsky never did and he couldn't have pulled it off anyway, was he threatened a fish-in to Mayor Daley because Mayor Daley saw O'Hare Airport as his crowning jewel. So Alinsky, he didn't say this out loud, but he let it get back to Daley that he was planning, if Daley didn't come meet with him, to have all his people go into O'Hare and take up all of the bathrooms, so that none of the people at the airport could go to the bathroom. Now, of course, he could never pull this off. People wouldn't even be willing to do it. I mean, what are you going to have little children walking around? They can't go to the bathroom. But Alinsky was so respected that Daley probably figured he might be crazy enough to actually do it. But most of the time, these tactics are not that amazing. I mean, what did the Tea Party do when they got together? They got a bunch of people to go to to these town hall meetings and really take over. Well, I mean, that's not, it's not rocket science. So tactics are not really the important part of organizing. Democracy is this part of organizing, the linking of democracy with power. And so if the Tea Party acts in a relatively democratic grassroots manner, then yeah, it resembles forms of Alinsky-based organizing. But if it's driven by an ideology that doesn't try to draw across at least a relatively diverse group of participants, it isn't the kind of organizing Alinsky believed in.
Okay. Aaron Schutz, professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Community Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, co-editor with Mike Miller of the book People Power, the Community Organizing Tradition of Saul Alinsky. If you want to check it out, you can go to organizedtrainingcenter.org. Aaron Schutz, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz.
It's good to have you with us, Mr. Secretary. Good morning.
Good morning, Bill.
Nice to talk to you again. I remember when you came to the briefing room a couple of months ago, right after in April, when the framework was adopted, and you laid it out for us at the White House, the reporters there. And I said to myself, they ought to put this guy on the road to sell this deal, because I thought you explained it better than anybody else I had heard. So tell our viewers and our listeners, why is this a good deal for the United States, first of all?
Well, first of all, it accomplishes quite a lot. And by the way, Bill, I would say that quite a bit was accomplished from that April briefing to the Vienna Agreement in July. Number one, the agreement represents a direct commitment of Iran to the United States that they will never build a nuclear weapon, and that gives us a lot better standing, particularly with the international unity that we have. Won over some pretty tough negotiations. It gives us a better standing should we have to respond strongly to any Iranian violation. Number two, the nuclear parameters really cut back and roll back the Iranian nuclear program dramatically. Number three, it has novel, unique, and stringent verification measures that go on for a very, very long time, actually forever. The agreement will always give us more insight into the Iranian program than we would have without it. And our Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, has made that statement. Fourth, I would say, again, I already referred to international unity. That was true in the negotiations. It's also true in the sanctions regime. And, of course, if the agreement were not to go through, that unity would be shattered, and we'd probably be left with the worst of all worlds, in which the sanctions regime frays, so Iran gets more resources in any case, and they have an unconstrained nuclear program with no verification. That's a pretty good summary of some of the issues.
That's an excellent summary. I find it very significant that you start out by saying Iran could never build, they agree they would never build a nuclear weapon. So this is a forever deal, not a 10-year deal. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's in that commitment. Furthermore, as I said, from Lausanne to Vienna, they've also agreed never to take part in a whole bunch of weaponization activities. That is the activities that you would need to go from uranium or plutonium to a bomb. And they've agreed to stay in the additional protocol, which is the basis of having the international inspectors go to undeclared suspicious sites. That's also forever.
What do you say, Mr. Secretary, then, to the argument that, we heard this last week from Senator Chuck Schumer, well, but 10 years from now, all bets are off, and the cattle be out of the horse out of the barn, right? That 10 years from now, everything will fall apart.
Well, with all due respect, I don't believe that is a correct statement. Number one, we have explicitly tough constraints on what they can do in their peaceful program for 15 years. I note specifically the dramatic reduction in their stocks of enriched uranium from 10 or 12,000 kilograms down to 300. That's for 15 years. But secondly, again, verification is critical. Sure, we need to have tough verification, and we do have that on their big nuclear sites. But, of course, a lot of the concern is what might they do covertly. And that's where this verification comes in. And we have features that are not present in any other verification program anywhere in the world.
On the verification issue, too, an argument that we've heard from over and over again from Prime Minister Netanyahu is, yeah, they say there's verification, but under the terms of this deal, they got 24 days, not 24 hours. You've heard it over and over again, but 24 days, and that's a lot of time. They could make a nuclear bomb in that time.
Yeah, well, again, number one is having the 24 days is actually one of the unique features that I referred to, because today, in other countries, with the additional protocol, once the international agency asks for access to a suspicious place within 24 hours, there's nothing to prevent the country from just rolling this out for a long, long time. Now we have, for the first time, a well-defined process. Within 24 days, they must provide access or be in violation. So then the real question is 24 days enough time to, quote, hide the evidence? Well, first of all, some have talked about, throwing the drugs down the toilet.
Yeah, flushing it down the toilet,
That is not an apt analogy to misuse of nuclear materials. We are very confident in our ability to find the residues of using nuclear materials in 24 days. In fact, we have an historical example in Iran. Back in 2003, they stretched it out for 6 months with the agency in a place in Tehran. They claimed they were doing nothing wrong. After 6 months, the agency went in, nailed them. So, we have that, and we have other experiments that we have carried out at our nuclear security laboratories that reinforce the idea that we have very, very strong tools. Certainly, I'm sorry, Bill, let me just add that.
Yeah, sure.
That 100% certitude is always tough, but the fact is, the risk level for Iran to try to evade this program is raised dramatically. So, the risk calculus is not in their favor.
And meanwhile, as I started to point out, as the president has pointed out, you've got 24/7 electronic monitoring of all of these sites.
Yeah,
correct?
All of their major nuclear sites. Another feature that is in this agreement is that Iran will allow the use of so-called advanced technologies, and that includes electronic seals, so the IAEA can do its job very, very efficiently. Again, there's a lot of novel things here. I'll just mention one more, which is very important, and that is that for 25 years, the IAEA, the international agency, will have surveillance of the entire uranium supply chain. That's, again, a new feature, and it means that if Iran wanted to evade, they're going to have to build an entire covert supply chain, probably in many places, 4 or 5 different geographies, and as you know, any chain has a weakest link, and we think we will be able to find them with pretty high confidence.
Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, our guest here on the Bill Press Show on our Newsline this morning. Mr. Secretary, what do you think is prompting behind Iran's willingness to make this deal and to step forward?
Well, I think in their society, they clearly have internal pressures. The sanctions, economic sanctions that have been so effective once the president was able to get international unity, that's probably set back their economy by about 20%. So it's a pretty big hit, number one. Number two, we see a lot of their population, especially their young people, who really want to fully re-engage the international community, including the West.
Right. And
I think that's a pressure that's built up. It's somewhat reflected in the election of President Rouhani, who is at least on the Iranian political spectrum one of the reformers. Third, I think that there is a tension in the society in terms of those who do want to reopen to the West and those, particularly the Revolutionary Guard, who seem to be much happier with the status quo. And that's not only ideological, I would say, but it's also because they have their tentacles into many, many parts of the economy. So I think there is an internal division here. This is very important. But I want to emphasize, as much as we may wish, that this agreement ends up opening up an avenue to more responsible Iranian behavior. This is not what the deal is based on. It's based upon not having them get a nuclear weapon. Now, I'll just add one other thing, and look, we remain, obviously sensitive to the statement that the suspension of sanctions will send more resources.
Yes.
And some part of those resources we have to assume will go to their military. We don't like their support for terrorism, Hezbollah, let's say. We don't like their fomenting regional instability in Syria or Yemen. We don't like their human rights violations, in particular the outrageous detention of American citizens. We don't like their anti-Semitic, anti-Israel rhetoric. And we have to push back hard on all of those. But this deal is about their not having a nuclear weapon and giving us, in fact, and our allies, Israel and the friendly Arab states, more ability to push back hard on those other activities.
Mr. Secretary, being generous with your time, I just have one last question to you and I want to ask this question, I've always wanted to ask this question of the critics of the deal. What happens if this deal just falls apart and there's no deal and then we just have to walk away from this?
Well, that's a great question, Bill, because we continue to say nobody has come forward with a credible plan B. Just take the nuclear dimensions. Let's say, how would you choose between a large nuclear program, unconstrained tomorrow, with no verification and no international unity, versus a program that has very strong constraints for 15 years, has verification forever, and has international unity to back up our responses, be they renewed sanctions or other potentially even military options. It's a pretty clear choice, and furthermore, the lack of international unity, meaning that we expect the sanctions regime would start to fray badly, and so they get their window into more resources begins opening now as well. So it's just not a very difficult choice to make.
It's a very clear case to me and a very strong case that you may make, Mr. Secretary, and we're counting on the Democrats in Congress and hopefully even a few Republicans to make the right choice or make the right decision. I think they will. Again, thank you on the behalf of all of us Americans for your great work over there, and thanks for joining us this morning, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks for the chance to lay out our case.
All right, you got it. Secretary Ernest Moniz.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Richard Perry, Aaron Schutz, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.